Welcome to the Shepherd's Cast. This content may not be suitable for some listeners. Good morning, good evening, and good night, my flock. Welcome to the Shepherd's Cast, the podcast where I read my short stories and explain the inspiration for why I wrote them. On today's episode, you will hear another excerpt from Heaper. But before we get into that, I'd like to take a minute to talk about what's been going on. I'm going to keep it kind of brief before I get into the reading because I got a lot more work to do on this short story collection before the publication date. The date it will be going to Amazon KDP will be March 22nd, which means it should be available not too long after that. We are just across the finish line, and the only thing that's really changed in terms of what you've heard on the podcast to what's going to be in the book is things are a lot cleaner due to the amount of editing that has been done. Plus, as I mentioned previously, there are 2 bonus short stories in the collection. That is The Rabbit and Through the Mushroom's Eyes. We did a t-shirt sale to collect money for the initial publication, and thank you to everyone who bought one. Those will be hopefully done soon and in your hands. If you haven't seen the t-shirts, take a look at my TikTok, which you can get from the artist website or by just going to the Shepherd's Cast on TikTok. The author website, once again, is theshepherdcast.wixsite.com/the-shepherd. And that sums everything up. I will send you guys on to listen to another excerpt from my novel, Heaper, upcoming soon. Publication date, not yet announced. Chapter 3. Tira. Shocking, muttered Tira as she turned back to the open doorway. As she steered, the dangling secret between their friendship couldn't have been more apparent. She tried to shake the feeling as the crawler crushed piles of old vehicle under its weight, but was unable to do so. What possible gain could he obtain by keeping this a secret? She wondered. Is he afraid I will turn him over to Eco? He knows I would not betray him. Perhaps it is out of fear. It continued to eat at her as they approached the city. The skyline came into full view, towering over the rubble. It consisted of 4 large towers placed in the 4 corners. They were laid perfectly in a grid, and were connected by walls of rusted vehicles, stacked intricately like bricks. Each of the 4 towers varied greatly in size and shape. The first, which was closest to the crawler from the direction they were approaching, was 4 walls of scrap metal riveted together. It stretched upward for 25 stories and came to a flat top. Its only features were the large green neon signs on each face. The towers were meant to spell out Scrap Forge Tower, but the side of the building that was visible to the crawler had many broken characters, leaving only the phrase Scap Ow. Tira spent much of her free time in this building. It was the main residence for reverse engineers, and contained the main market for tools and machinery. The bells and whistles of their current workspace had been purchased there. The building to the east of the Scrap Forge Tower was Fragmenta's automated factory run by Eco Flank. Tira studied Flank in depth during her engineering training. She knew it was given the name by Joshua Kalvix when he invented the electro-deflector shield, which was now referred to as an EDS system. Eco found it important to use the shielding tech to keep trash droids deflected away from civilizations, and gave Flank the coder's blessing, allowing the city to mass-produce their product and receive the 141 codes of Eco. This, of course, came with a mountain of supplies, which Kalvix allocated to the citizens of Fragmenta. The factory itself was almost a perfect cube. It was 9 stories tall, and nearly exact same dimension in length and width. However, the uniformity of the cube was broken by the rippled tin roofing that layered its shell. The tin was torn in many areas, and in some places was non-existent. Atop the building, A large hologram illuminated the sky depicting Contaminos being covered in a hexagonal shield. This was Ecoflank's symbol. The towers on the other side of the city, north of Scrapforge and Flank, were exact copies of one another. They were large cylindrical spires that stretched upwards and at their end supported pointed cones. Numerous braces and supports stretched from the base, holding the tips of the spires into place. It seemed that without the support, the bulky tops would tip off their slender bases. Each of them had a mounted edge device at their peak. They worked in unison to place a faintly visible, hexagonal bubble around the city. Unlike the bedraggled buildings that stood in the other two corners, the code towers were built by Eco, and made from components of the highest quality. Each riveted piece of metal was perfectly laid and polished, and the neon lights that ascended the tower were all in working condition. Each tower had the words, "Follow it," written vertically in pink. Dorvin told Tira that they were nothing more than propaganda, but he hadn't been in Fragmenta before the deal with Eco. Neither had Tira, but her father had taught her the importance of these towers. The sound of his voice filled her head as she stared at them. "Your grandfather told me stories about life before Eco," he had said when Tira was questioning why Eco had seemed so harsh. "There was starvation and constant scuffling with the nearby cults. Old Eco may have been brutal and unforgiving with their punishment, but they came to Fragmenta and delivered on the promise of their deal. They provided a livable place and dealt with those cults. Those towers are a place to worship not only the sacrifices Eco made, but also their mission to contact the Senders." Tira's father left her head as the crawler slipped through the hexagonal shield without resistance. Just along the wall, directly between the two southern towers, there was a clearing in the sand where crawlers were meant to be parked. She found an empty spot and entered the parking sequence on the button pad. Knowing the force of her beast, she braced herself against the open archway, prepping herself for the approaching halt. Dorvin, as always, struggled with attention to detail and was not prepared for the braking maneuver. The abrupt stop sent him sprawling onto the floor. He cried out in pain as the cut reopened on the grid-like metal mesh of the floor. "What was that for, T?" he questioned indignantly as he clenched his dripping red palm. She smiled slyly and sarcastically replied, "I thought you liked being tossed around." "Not with RE girls." He grabbed a scrap piece of cloth from the barrel in the washroom. Once he returned with it draped over his cut, he continued, "You'd think, with the amount of training they've had, they wouldn't be so high maintenance." She entered another sequence on the button pad. "If I were not so high maintenance, we would not survive this mesa." As she spoke, the crawler's legs began creaking and popping loudly. The pod was wincing as it lowered itself to the ground. Tira looked outward from the door to make sure the docking procedure was going as planned. To lower itself, the crawler was squatting under great stress, creating 3 archways with its legs. She observed the middle joints, which were at the peak of each of the archways, to make sure they could withstand the pressure of lowering the central chamber. The tension grew greater in both the material and Tira's heart. When the pod finally hit the ground, the stress in the pod's legs vanished. "Could you look any more stressed about parking the crawler?" asked Dorvin with a smirk on his face and dried blood on his hand. "Those crab sticks are not the best doll." Tira cut her sentence short as she looked outward from the ground-level crawler. Its legs were now retracted against the side of the pod, creating a pyramid shape above the cap of the chamber. Just outside the wall, near the city's open gate, a crowd was gathered. Dorvin interrupted the silence. "Did a beat get your tongue, or are you just—" "Shh, come look," she interrupted with an aggressive whisper. Together, they stood in the doorway, looking at the crowd of people gathering in a semicircular shape. There seemed to be a lot of murmurs and whispers amongst the crowd. From their current location, they could not see what was causing the commotion. "Let's get a closer look," Tira whispered, stepping down out of the crawler. "Lock the crawler behind you." They quietly approached the crowd and pushed themselves part of the way through for a better view. After they found themselves in the center of the mass, Tira turned to a green-hexed gentleman to his right. He had short, spiked hair on the top of his head and was wearing a pair of brass spectacles on the end of his nose. His neck was completely lacking a pattern, but his face was covered. As he raised his hands in a shrugging gesture, a layer of orange dust fell from his baggy striped shirt. Just as he opened his mouth to speak, Tira's question was answered from the opening at the center of attention. A man was shouting in an uptight, nasally voice. As promised, all public sentencings and fragmenta will be done by yours truly, just so you can see that we are still in control of the code. Again, I feel that this is ridiculous and a wasteful of Eco's time. The Amendment 142 officers are perfectly capable of doing this, but I digress. He adjusted his voice and began the sentencing. We gathered today to sentence Corvin Doctrine for his crimes against the Eco Code. The shouting Crimson Man was sporting a traditional sentencer garb, which included a perfectly clean, white trench coat with no sleeves. It was marked with the number 141 vertically on each side of the overlapping fabric. The belt of the coat was wrapped snugly around his waist and resembled the desert's bright orange color. The hood atop his head shared the same hue. The figure looked down upon the teenage boy at his feet. The boy's posture showed his fear. He laid curled, his light gray hexes stained by the orange sand's presence, his hands bound by jangling metal chains. The stains of the mesa also assaulted the cleanliness of his black shirt and jeans. As he sat up, those sands sifted from the clothing, and the two chains rattled helplessly. Dorvin and Tira both caught a glimpse of the boy's face. He had wavy, blue hair that came to a peak just over top the front of his forehead. His emerald eyes matched the glow of his river, and from the look of youth on his face, he could not have been more than 16 years of age. The boy got to his knees and pled with the sentencer. "Please, I wasn't doing anything wrong," he exclaimed, his hands clasped instinctively in front of his face. "We are together. We were just curious. We watched Sender sex films and wanted to try something new." Tears were streaming down Corvin's face, but the sentencer did not hear his plea. Then a command oozed from the slimy man, in the form of a simple gesture to the two figures standing next to him. The one to his left was a brown-haired, red-hexed woman with a blue glow. She was nearly identical to the enforcer, except that she was a shade darker and appeared to be in extraordinary physical shape compared to him. Her face was fierce, and her clothing was fitted with a red belt. Red was reserved for code enforcers. The enforcer to his right shared the same attire as the woman, but was much larger physically. He towered over the rest of the Lloyds, and his hexes were wider than the palm of Tira's hand. Their dark purple color looked strangely mismatched when combined with his red belt. However, the bright white light that glowed between his hexes complemented the trench coat perfectly. In the hand of the towering enforcer was a golden, spoon-shaped object with a bulky, round grip and a small, rectangular button panel. Tira, Dorvin, and the rest of the crowd all recognized the Scooper, an eco-produced device used for upholding the code. It was fitted with multiple different tools that all appeared to spontaneously appear with the correct sequence of buttons. The enforcer typed a code into the button pad of the golden device, and the spoon showed its menacing snarl. The port, which contained the spoon, grew two mantis-like mechanical appendages, which moved with the enforcer's thumb on the button pad. The fierce woman with the long, brown hair grabbed both of the boy's hands and forced them behind his back, causing his plea to become a shriek of desperation. "Please, no!" he screamed. Unwavering, the sentencer continued with his speech. "For the crime of gazing upon Mr. Fizdal's daughter, I sentence you to the scooping of one eye. This violates Code 102. He nodded in the direction of the hulking man. The hulking man grabbed the wriggling boy by the hair and held his head firmly still. The boy was screaming and kicking violently, searching for any means of freedom. However, the purple Lloyd was far too firm to budge from the teenager's blows. With one swift motion, the scooper was plunged into the left socket of the boy's face. His fear was conquered by agony as the two appendages flailed, grasping for flesh. When they caught hold, they sank themselves deeply into his eye. Its claws were a weak muscle, failing to curl the weight they had set out to lift. They pinched and struggled, but seemed to fail to make progress, and just when it seemed like hope was lost, they flexed one final time, pulling the eye free. It popped loud enough that Tira could hear, even in the cacophony of groans from the crowd, and the shrieking pain of the boy. Red, watery juice from the eye streamed down his face. Tira turned her head from the scene, feeling a lurch in her stomach. In the direction of her gaze, she noticed a girl crying profusely. Her blue hexes were a depressing complement to her sorrow, and her unkempt curly black hair grew even wilder as she ran her patternless fingers through it. Tira thought she had to be about 18. Next to her, An older gray-bearded, blue-hexed man was loudly cheering on the enforcers as they scooped. Tira suddenly realized the situation. Mr. Fizdall was dealing with her daughter's boyfriend. "Code abusers," muttered Tira under her breath. "Why am I not shocked?" "Huh?" questioned Dorvin, looking up at her. After glancing in the direction of her gaze, he too realized the situation. "Oh shit," he muttered. Mr. Fizdall's blue-hexed daughter suddenly broke away from her father's arms and ran to her boyfriend. She dove, knees first, into the sand and wrapped her arms around him. The hulking purple man did not pay attention to this. He had cut the eye from the optical nerve and had tied it around his wrist as a fleshy piece of jewelry. The other enforcer, however, grabbed the girl by the hair and viciously ripped her off the boy. She landed hard in the sand, which covered her black tank top with the mace's color. When she sat up and tried to lunge back at Corvin, she was thrown to the ground again. This time, her father moved from the crowd and apprehended her. As she was pulled to her feet, the tank top tore and dangled loosely from her body. Beneath the cloth, a large oval-shaped patch of hexless skin was revealed. It overlapped her exposed breasts, which she tried to cover with her hand. Mr. Fizdall did not break stride despite his daughter being exposed. "His punishment is over," she cried frantically. "We can be together now." "Not yet it isn't," interrupted the sentencer. "For the punishment of lying with Mr. Fizdall's daughter non-consensually, the code sentences Corvin Darkshire to the removal of the hand that violated her." "No," the daughter screamed. "I love him. It was consensual." "Silly girl," the sentencer announced. "The code and the people gathered here today can see that you have been brainwashed by the boy." Murmurs of agreement burst from the crowd. The two enforcers grabbed the boy once more. The long-nosed censor continued, "If I may quote, 'Young love is not consensual unless agreed upon by the father of the daughter.' This is Code 103 under the Eco-Enforcement System. This is to protect young children from making rash decisions that may result in an underage pregnancy." "I am an adult," she pleaded. "The boy is 16, he replied angrily, pointing at the one-eyed teen. "That makes this a clear violation." We were together before she turned 18, said Corvin weakly, sobbing through the words. Tira gathered that the boy's claim was probably true, but she knew the boy would have no way of providing proof. "They're just kids," shouted Dorvin, letting his hatred for the system be known. "Quiet!" yelled a nasally man. "Quiet, or I will have you punished for interfering with code enforcement. That is Code 2 under Eco Law." "I'm sorry," muttered Corvin, who could barely move. The hulking purple man, who had just finished tying his new symbol of honor, looked down at him. "Sorry, don't cut it, kid," he said, with a heavy grunt. He entered a sequence on his scooper, and the spoon attachment, along with the mantis appendages, retracted. The device dispensed a circular cuff at the end of it. Without hesitation, he slipped the cuff over the boy's wrist. Corvin was no longer making noise or struggling. However, when the button to start the device was pressed, the screaming returned with a vengeance. Blades from all sides ejected from the device, like teeth on a beat, and sank deeply into the boy's flesh. The serrated knives oscillated back and forth for a few moments, taking more depth with each pass. Blood trickled through the grooves of his forearms, covering his green glow. It struggled and slowed as it reached the bone of the boy's wrist. And as it struggled, the screaming suddenly came to a halt. He had passed out from the shock, but the scooper was no reader of emotions. It continued its gruesome task. Most of the crowd, Tira and Dorvin included, were whining and groaning as the repetitive squelching sound came from the boy's flesh. Mr. Fizdall, however, was not amongst the most. He whooped and whistled at the boy's punishment. Meanwhile, his daughter, who had stopped crying, stared mournfully in Corvin's direction, as if he were already dead. As the crowd began to adjust to the sight, the bone gave way, and the hand dangled from a piece of sinew for a moment. Then it broke free and landed on the ground. The woman enforcer picked it up and wrapped it in a green cloth. She grabbed a chain with an attached hand-imprinted circular plate and inserted her own palm into the groove. She turned it, causing the chain to consciously bind itself around the cloth, wrapping the hand into a salvage save. It appeared half the size of the hand it contained. "Finally," announced the enforcer, "for the crime of running from eco-enforcement, the boy is sentenced to tabloid repurposing. Then he will be released back to the public of Fragmenta. Please let this be an example of control Eco still has." With the final decree, The two enforcers released the chains that bound the boy and began to carry him around the corner of Scrapforge Tower, leaving the crowd to gaze upon the blood that was slowly seeping into the sand. And welcome back. I know, only one chapter, only 20 minutes, but it is something. Quite honestly, I'm very, very busy with the final edit of the short story collection, and I was just gonna not do another episode until the release, but that would leave, 5-6 weeks in between episodes, and I at least wanted to check in with you guys, let you know that I'm still alive, though my sleep hours would disagree with that statement. But let's not talk about that right now. Let's talk about what you just listened to. This is one of my favorite chapters in the novel. Well, at least the first part of the novel. The novel has 4 parts to it. And in my opinion, this chapter is really the one that captures the situation that our main characters are in. It captures what life is like inside of Fragmenta, and it captures what eco-law is like. This whole desperate cling to control, and this whole change of soft eco to hard eco to old eco to new eco. It's all meant to be very confusing, as if they don't really know what it is they're trying to accomplish with their law system. They are simply trying to accomplish their task, and offering control was the only way they could think of getting the technologies they need from these random inventors across the mesa. You will get to hear more of this, maybe. I'm not sure if I'm going to do a third part before we move on to the second season, which will be Vim. Vim is going along well, along with the edit. I think that the first episode is entirely done, but we are not going to move towards doing that until the release happens. And I think I want to try to do like a trailer or something along those lines for Vim to get the hype back up, get the crowd back together, and have a nice release for this episode. First episode of the season, I mean. Alright, I think this short little episode is good enough, and that's where I'm going to leave it. Thank you for listening, and as always, may the flock disperse until we congregate again.